Welcome to our session on culture wars in the United States and Israel with Dr. Gadi Taub and Dr. Peter Berkowitz. My name is Aylana Meisel, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Tikvah Fund in Israel and the chair of our legal initiative, the Israel Law and Liberty Forum. I'm delighted to say that we have with us two of the best thinkers on the culture, one from each country. I want to introduce our guests and then we can sink right in. In the studio with me is Dr. Gadi Taub, an Israeli historian, author, screenwriter, and political commentator. He's a senior lecturer in the School of Public Policy and the Department of Communications at Hoover University. He is an advisory board member of our academic institute, Machon Al-Gaman, at Tikvah, Israel. He's the author of a number of best-selling works of fiction and several non-fiction books on Israeli culture and politics, an op-ed columnist for Haaretz, and a regular contributor on politics and culture in the Israeli media. He is known in Israel for his criticism of postmodernism and post-Zionism. And for those of you who speak Hebrew, I encourage you to check out his podcast on YouTube called Shomrei Asaf, or The Gatekeepers. Dr. Peter Berkowitz is the Tad and Diane Taub Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution in Stanford University. From 2019 to 2021, he served as the director of the State Department's policy planning staff, executive secretary of the department's Commission on Unalienable Rights, and senior advisor to the Secretary of State. He's a 2017 winner of the Bradley Prize. In addition, he serves as Dean of Studies for the Public Interest Fellowship and teaches for the Tikvah Fund in the US and in Israel. He's written 4 books and edited 7, and studies and writes about, among other things, constitutional government, conservatism, progressivism, liberal education, national security and the law, and Middle East politics. You can read him everywhere, but certainly also in his weekly column at Real Clear Politics. So we're going to be exploring this question through the lens of a recent book by Dr. Taub, by Gadi, called Nayadim V'Nayachim. He'll be kind enough to give us the English title in a moment. It's a stellar cultural and political commentary which has reached bestseller status in Israel. Gadi, can you give us the title and also explain the thesis?
Well, thanks for the generous introduction. The literal translation of the title is "The Mobile and the Sedentary: the attack of the upper classes on Israel's democracy." It rings better in Hebrew. I think if we translate it to English, it would be "Global Elites and National Citizens."
Okay, what's the argument?
It's an attempt to show that the new elites, and not just in Israel, are increasingly identify themselves more with their peers in other countries than with the nations they come from, and correspondingly they develop not just a globalist vision but an anti-democratic vision, so which I think should be defined as anti-democratic liberalism. And the argument, I think, would sound familiar to anyone reading highbrow newspapers in the West today, because it usually goes something around the idea that, well, the masses of citizens are so bigoted and racist that we should save democracy from them. And so the argument is always, how do we save democracy from the citizens? And I think that we don't always notice it because most of the rhetoric is directed against nationalism, and we don't always stop to notice that inside the velvet glove of the critique of nationalism, there is an iron fist directed at democracy. And this is why these elites tend to find way to bypass democracy. In Israel, the idea of judicial supremacy is, I think, is on steroids, much more than anywhere in the West. But if you look at Europe and the European Union, if you look at the way those elites prefer the idea of universal human rights to specific civil rights anchored in the nation state, if you look at their support for international institutions, Israel is now in trouble with the ICC, the International Criminal Court. So they usually prefer international institutions to national local law. They usually support lax immigration policies because they resent the nation state and its borders. And by borders, I mean the actual physical borders of the state, the limits of the citizenry, and the the limits of national identity. So immigration is usually an issue. You can see it in America, you can see it in Europe, and you can see it in Israel. And I think that America, Israel, and Europe, their elites share much of the same traits.
So we're going to open up the question of immigration as a case study in a moment. But before that, Peter, do you have a response about how this plays out in the American context?
I do. And I want to say it's great to be, excuse me, with you, Aylana, and with Gadi. Gadi's written a terrific book. And he's done something very striking by illuminating an internal dynamic within Israeli society, within Israeli politics. He's actually illuminated a dynamic within liberal democracy more generally. After all, the mobile anywheres and the sedentary somewheres of Israel actually correspond quite closely to groups within the United States. In the United States, we speak of blue America and red America. We sometimes make that division in terms of states. We speak of red states and blue states. Blue states vote Democratic and they're progressive. Red states tend to vote Republican. We think of them as conservative, but they fit into Gadi's category of the sedentary. But this is a kind of mistake to think in terms of states. We should really think in terms of cities. You're in blue America if you live in an urban center, and in any state, 30 miles, 50 miles from the urban center, you're in red America, or in Gadi's sedentary area, where people are more concerned with the local, where people are likely to stay, where people are more likely to think that to be patriotic is something that they should take pride in, rather a term of reproach. And so a question arises, why, not only in Israel, but also in the United States, and not only in those two countries, but also in Britain, and also in France, and in Eastern and Central Europe. Everywhere we see Western-style liberal democracies, we see the development of these two classes. I prefer to call one you can also call the one a progressive elite, the others, we now in the United States, we think of populist conservatism. Where does that come from? Well, Gadi discusses this in his book, and I just want to underscore that our educational systems really have become intellectual factories for the production of progressive ideologues. And this explains why our courts, our bureaucracies, our universities, our media, Silicon Valley, Wall Street, all these redoubts of the political and intellectual elite are so determined to spread and to live in accordance with the ideas, the sensibility that Gadi has described under the category of the mobile.
I think if you look at it almost graphically, you could say that the elites are more horizontal in the fact that they look to their peers in other countries and they emphasize the present and maybe the future, while the sedentary or the anywheres, the somewheres, you're using the better terms. I think that Goodhart used in his book, The Road to Somewhere. The sedentaries are, I would say, it's horizontal and
vertical.
And vertical, thank you. Because they are tied to their roots, they are tied to their traditions, to the past, and most importantly, to a local market. So what the book tries to do is connect the idea of globalist ideology and versus patriotism on the other hand, to I'd say a sociological and class element, because I think that what is most revealing about those elites is that first and foremost they can move, so they can take their livelihood and their profession, whether it's through a laptop or if you are maybe a physician, an MD, you can take your profession and move it somewhere else, while the majority of the somewheres are first and foremost tied economically to a local market and to a local language. The second most important thing is that I think that the national majorities are also dependent on the nation state for their control of their own destiny. So if you are not super ultra rich, you lose control. You lose political control of your destiny without the nation states. So the issue of immigration is, of course, central to all this, because I think that everywhere the mobile elites are trying to equalize the status of citizens and immigrants.
Well, let's go into it a bit more,
sure,
because you discuss it at length in your book, and it's also obviously a hot topic in the States.
And here.
Yes. So let's use that as a case study to apply the themes that you're talking about, the Israeli case.
I tried to build a chapter on immigration in conjunction with the increasing role of the courts, because in Israel it's really striking. The court is I don't know if globalist is maybe too strong a word, but it's sort of post-national, so that increasingly the court is trying to nudge Israel slowly from being a Jewish state to a status of what we call here a non-national state of all its citizens. And one of the ways it is doing it, and this is why this has become the arena for the question of the role of the court, what we call here judicial activism, is that the court has struck down all and every law that the elected branches of government had tried to use in order to limit illegal immigration. And we have managed to build a wall, by the way. So this is the one thing that the United States hasn't managed to do, or at least not to finish, and we have. But all other forms of even encouragement of illegal immigrants to go back to their countries has been struck down by the court, and the rhetoric against it is always the same, and it's the same, of course, in America. It's the same. It's the same if you consider the Brexit. If you consider the discussion in Germany. It's anyone who's trying to limit immigration is immediately labeled a racist. So that we always look at the dimension of xenophobia, but and the anti-liberal elements, which there are in anti-immigration advocacy groups, and we don't look at the side of democracy. So if you consider Brexit, all we heard from the liberal media about Brexit was that these people are xenophobes and racists, and we didn't hear that at least a large part of the supporters of Brexit supported it because they felt they were losing control over their own common destiny with decision making moving to Brussels. We tend to portray this worldview in which either you're a liberal or you're a racist, and we sort of assume implicitly that if you're a liberal, you're for democracy, while the mobile classes and the ultra progressives and the liberal are actually what I tried to define in the book as anti-democratic liberals, because they're for liberalism, but they're attacking the ability of citizens to control their own fate. They're attacking popular sovereignty, which is the basis of democracy. So it's convenient for them to say that anyone who is not supportive of their extreme progressive form of liberalism is also anti-democratic, but the reverse is the same, is the truth, because populism to a large extent, and the red states and Trumpism in America and Brexit in England are also an attempt to defend the ability of citizens to control their own fate.
So I want to ask Peter about about his take on immigration in the American context. But before we do that, can we just take a few sentences for, I think probably a lot of Americans aren't as familiar with what's happened here, and certainly the way that you write about it and what measures the court has taken or not. Just sikum, like a summary of the immigration issue itself.
Well, there's been an influx of immigrants from Africa, which has turned the issue volatile because immediately anyone who touches it is the issue of race springs up, even when it's not exactly relevant. So Israel has built a wall. It built holding facilities. So the court struck down the ability to hold illegal immigration. First, it struck. This
is happening over a period of about 10 years or a bit more.
Yeah, a little more.
Yeah.
It's from the mid first decade of the 2000s, and then it struck down. And then when it struck down the holding facilities, the court itself suggested a sort of pension fund. That is, that the illegal immigrants can work in Israel, but they should deposit 20% of their salary, which would be returned to them upon leaving. This was the court's suggestion. And then gradually the court moved to strike down that too. And now the court has, and this is, I'm sure, a touchy issue for American conservatives, certainly Reform Jews, is that the court now approved of a giyur, a conservative and reform conversion in Israel, which gives you, if you look at the general structure of Israeli law, it gives you a shortcut, a highway to the law of return. So basically almost any illegal immigrant can now have a short procedure of conversion and then claim the ability to use the law of return and become a citizen almost automatically. So this means we will have no control over immigration. This the courtesy of the Supreme Court.
So the Supreme Court in Israel is a primary driver, as you see it, of this sort of anti-democratic imposition of elite values, universalist values on society. Now, in the States, I'm sure it'll play out a bit differently. We have a different governmental structure. The court is much more restrained, although, of course, immigration is a very hot political issue. Peter, could you relate something to the themes that Gadi's outlined, but in the American context?
Sure. I think as in Israel, so too in the United States, the immigration issue is about more than immigration. And we have in the United States not only an increasingly anti-democratic liberalism, but from my point of view, an illiberal liberalism. That is, a liberalism that's not committed as it should be to protecting fundamental rights, but a liberalism that's committed to promoting, entrenching a certain progressive interpretation. Take what's happening on the border, the American border now, the U.S. border with Mexico. Since the Biden administration entered in January, there's been a great increase in immigrants. Immigrants are being let into the United States. They don't have proper papers to do so. They're not being checked for COVID-19, despite the Biden administration's attempt to continue to impose strict lockdowns and mask requirements. So why are non-citizens being allowed into the United States, indeed effectively being invited to come to the United States? Because immigration is also a great symbolic issue. We have in the United States, in the way you have in Israel and Britain and elsewhere, a fight over who's going to be in charge and what is going to be the locus of lawmaking power. What's going to be the locus of the rule of law? Is the locus of the rule of law, as in the modern tradition of freedom, as in classical liberalism, is it going to be the nation state, which makes the determinations, or is it going to be international bodies, International Criminal Court, International Court of Justice, the United Nations, and so on? And increased immigration opening the gates, insisting that the requirement that you comply with legal requirements, all that is seen as, and properly, all that is seen as shoring up the traditional nation state. So, open borders helps weaken that nation state. And by the way, I want to add that it also feeds into another distinction that's important. It appears in Gadi's writings. It's very important for us to talk about. And it corresponds to his distinction between the sedentary and the mobile, the anywheres and the somewheres, blue America and red America. And that's the distinction between those whose fundamental orientation toward their country is one of grievance, increasingly the mobiles, because it's a country after all, it's a nation state, and those whose fundamental orientation toward their country is one of gratitude, gratitude for the plenty that it's provided, the order that it's provided, the language, the principles in which our political life takes place. This is
and in Israel, the vaccines,
please.
Peter. The vaccines, I'm adding to what the nation state has given its citizens, especially here.
Right, an amazing achievement, which, by the way, just in the United States over the last week or 10 days, there's been some controversy because the Biden administration is intent on denying that the Trump administration had anything whatsoever to do with the production of world historical vaccines in record time that are safe, that are efficacious, and that have already done a great deal to make Israel it appears the first country that which a majority of its citizens are vaccinated. Yes,
I'm going to bring us back to culture, though.
Go right ahead.
All right, fantastic. So, can I ask before we move on whether there are other sort of cultural fronts in Israel and in the United States that you see as sort of the next frontiers for the culture war, expressing the themes that we're discussing between elites, rooted, so on?
I think we're imitating the state. So Peter, tell us what does the future hold for us? Are we going to cancel culture too?
For sure you are, because as Gadi, as you know, as a man of the university world, there's an increasing expectation within Israel that to become a professor at an Israeli university, you should get a PhD abroad. Many seek their PhDs, as Gadi did in the United States. Unlike Gadi, many people who study abroad bring back from the United States the increasingly bad intellectual habits that we cultivate within our universities. So in no time, I'm confident you'll tell me it's already arrived, Israel will import, I presume, the America's progressive elites' determination to promulgate the ideas of diversity, inclusion, and equity. What do these ideas stand for? They stand for the idea that all men and women, everybody of any race, religion, creed, sex, or sexual orientation will think the exact same way about the appropriate public policies in regard to racial justice. Once in the United States, and not too long ago, it was thought that America's constitutional tradition, the soaring promises of America's Declaration of Independence, require that we treat everybody equally, regardless of race, ethnicity, sex, sexual orientation. The teachings of diversity, inclusion, and equity tell us that we need to treat people unequally on the basis of race, sex, sexual orientation. So this discriminatory policy, I fully expect to arrive on the shores of the Mediterranean, on the edge of the Middle East, in no time. We have a progressive elite in the United States. which is strongly encouraging, and by the way, you might ask where, within our universities, within our legacy media, Wall Street, Silicon Valley.
Big tech.
And big tech, Silicon Valley, and not least within the federal bureaucracy, through the doctrines of diversity, inclusion, and equity. The culture wars are being intensified through this doctrine that we must now view more and more social, political, cultural interaction through the lens of race, and we must classify people, we must recognize people's race and treat them differently on the basis of their race. A very dangerous doctrine for a truly liberal democracy.
Well, as somebody who studied in the States, and of course Tikvah itself is based in New York, it's based in Israel, we look forward to encouraging the sort of cross-pollination intellectually between people who study with us in both places. But what option is there for an Israeli who wants to get ahead as a PhD in the world of academia or in the world of culture, if it isn't to go to these places that we're now saying is exporting this sort of cultural struggle?
I'm tempted to say with Jordan Peterson, don't go there.
Don't go there.
I studied at the end of the 90s, the beginning of the 2000s, in an American history, in a history department in an American history program, and we were, I think, in my class, some 35 students, and there were only 2 who were willing to sometimes not trash America about everything. It was me and a Japanese student. We were the only ones willing to say anything good about America, because my father loved history, and so when I was very critical, I think in high school or something, of America, of the capitalism and imperialism and all that, he looked at it over his glasses. He had this, and he said, "You do remember that America saved the world from the Germans twice, and that was before it saved us also from the Soviets, before the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the Soviet Empire in '91." And it's amazing that people are not willing to see anything good about American culture. But if you look at a cross-cultural perspective, I think that Peter is right in saying that all these elites have their relation to their own nation is one of grievance. And this is the way they are trying to revise history everywhere. So it's what you study in post-colonial studies in America or about Western Europe, you study in Israel. There's an Israeli version called post-Zionism, in which everything about Zionism is horrible and terrible and colonial, and everything about and this is just a branch of the West, which is, of course, the source of all evil. And we're somehow taught that implicitly all the minorities are true liberals. That is, liberalism is illiberal, but all of liberalism's enemies, they are the true protectors and guardians of human rights. And it all starts from, I think, the misleading idea that people thought that you enhance equality if you don't just treat people equally, you also treat values equally. So all values are created equal. And then immediately, of course, you run into contradictions, because what are you going to say about, I don't know, the Nazis, that you should treat Hitler's view and Mahatma Gandhi's view as equals? Of course, this is a logical impossibility, but the whole thing rides. The whole thing is structured over something that I don't think is an argument. I think it's a sentiment, and it's the desire of elites with bad conscience to cleanse themselves by this ritual of endlessly beating on your own or your group's chest, usually by not identifying with your own group. So I saw this on the internet in some school in New York, that they are busy of, I don't know how they call it, de-whiting themselves or cleansing themselves of whiteness or some other ridiculous idea. And you look at it, and it has nothing to do with helping minorities in any way. What it has to do with is making yourself feel better and busy yourself with virtue signaling.
we're going to come up on time soon, so I have a couple of final questions, and I'd love to get your thoughts. The first is, this is obviously an international conference. It's being broadcast to Americans, it's being broadcast to Israelis, and even a few Europeans slipped in, which is great. How does your book apply to, let's say, an analysis of American Jews, people who are supposed to be part, in our view, of the Jewish people? So they already have an allegiance that crosses borders. Of course, the American Jewish experience is also somewhat unique, and they have, I would say, probably a role in driving or in helping drive a lot of different political and cultural trends in the States. So how do they fit into your thinking, if at all?
Well, first of all, I don't think it's my duty or my right to tell them how to perceive of their own identity. I know that Zionism, being a national identity, is problematic for Jews in the diaspora. But when we do come into contact, is that now I feel, and I had this unpleasant exchange over the pages of Haaretz with David Myers, the president of the New Israel Fund. Increasingly, I think progressive Jews in America think that they should change Israel to fit their liberal agenda there, so they can more easily find favor with liberal progressive elites by distancing themselves from us, Peter Beinart style, or by somehow changing us to be the right state of all its citizens that they somehow imagine. And I think that we should resist this, because Israel and the diaspora should respect each other's different definition of Judaism, unless we interfere with each other's definition. If we do interfere with each other's definition, I think we will find it harder, not easier, to have a fruitful dialogue.
Okay, let's spend our last few minutes trying to understand the where to. How do we turn the ship around? What's the situation looking like in Israel? And what's the situation looking like in the US? Maybe we could start with Peter, and then Gadi will have the final word.
Well, I think it's important to remember that grievance and gratitude, these are not vices and virtues that come from nowhere. It's our educational system that has produced not just a generation. Gadi has told us that 20 years ago, grievance culture was already richly flourishing in graduate schools in the United States. And I think that's right. One could go back much further. So, Aylana, you ask, where do we go? Where do we turn? Actually, a route, not the only route. There are sociological routes, as Gadi has explained, but a very important route of the grievance culture, including the grievance culture that is actually that prospers among a certain segment of Jews in the United States, is a result of education, the curriculum, and the spirit in which students are educated. Your natural orientation is not contempt for your country, especially not when the country is a country that provides the kinds of freedom and opportunity that the United States provides, and not only for Jews. So what is to be done is, well, there are many fronts on which to counter the trends that we've all been discussing here. A crucial front on which to counter these trends is in the field of education, and I will conclude by saying we need even more of the fine work that Tikvah and organizations like it have been doing in order to present students and adults too with an alternative vision, an alternative understanding, which for a long time was the traditional understanding of liberal democracy in the United States, the traditional proper understanding of America's constitutional principles, and proper understanding of a nation state in securing our rights, not least our rights to determine how we will govern ourselves.
I don't mean to put you on the spot, but as much as I agree with the response, and I do, of course, working where I work. Is the implication of what you've said that working through traditional institutions is nigh on impossible at this point? Or do you see some route opening up?
It's certainly not impossible, and we can't, and I don't recommend abandoning them. We have to do as much as we can within established institutions, but we cannot rely on established institutions in the United States today to give a fair and accurate, a rich, full-bodied understanding of the American political tradition, of America's achievements, and by the way, yes, of course, a fair-minded and full assessment of where the United States has fallen short of its principles, where we need to make progress. What we need is a synthesis, of course, as Edmund Burke taught us long ago, of the disposition to preserve and the ability to improve. But our established institutions, in my judgment, are failing us in this matter. So even as we continue to do our best to reform them by working within, we also need to redouble our efforts to create other kinds of institutions to educate young men and women, and also, I should say, to provide that kind of adult education that many people out in the world seek as they despair of acquiring as they regret, as they come to discover that their colleges and universities didn't provide them a decent education in what the United States stands for.
Oh, Gadi, things are somewhat different in Israel because the population is more naturally conservative in its instincts. How do you see the future?
Well, first, I think the good news is that this trend is running to such extremes that it will at some point begin to implode. I think, and if I may quote my late mother, who was a secret intellectual, she said, I think it was 20 years ago, she said, you know what's going to finish postmodernism? Boredom. Boredom. It's endlessly repetitive, endlessly. It's whatever you put into this meat grinder, the sausage you get at the end says that it doesn't matter what the truth is. All that matters is who decides what the truth is and for what reason. And the answer is always the same: hegemonic group in favor of preserving its elite status. So no matter what you study, you come to the same conclusion. At one point, people are going to see the fallacy, I think. So, but in the meantime, I'm pessimistic about universities because they are conservative not in their orientation, but in their sociological structure, because they keep reproducing the same ideas by virtue of their tenor system. So I think that there is great importance in what intellectuals are doing. For example, the work that Peter's team did in the State Department on unalienable rights and connecting them to national traditions, universal rights, and their connection to local traditions. And there's a hierarchy where ideas are formulated in the most abstract sense by thinkers and intellectuals, and these later influence people who, if they don't become professors in established universities, go to Tikvah or to the Hoover Institution or other places. And then there will be a thirst at the bottom, because I think that people who are force-fed this ideology in university become sick of it, and this is what happened to me when I left the left and moved to the right. Is I felt I'm finally breathing some fresh air, because there's so many times did I hear this thing, and that I heard this exact phrase, of course, which is, of course, this is not something you can say, but, and then someone tells you what they can't say, but they believe. So I think that honesty is also, in the long run, on our side, and honesty has its own charms, even if you get socially ostracized, which is not always so bad.
Agreed. Actually, it occurs to me, Peter, that although you were in the Trump administration. You are the only one on this panel who has yet to be branded as part of the vast right-wing conspiracy in Israel. And I hope that we've done good work to get there. So with that, with ending on an optimistic note and roping you well into this network, I want to thank you both for your thoughts. Again, Nayadim v'Nayachim is the book. And I look forward to continuing to work together to make a better future with people connected to their own values and traditions, in this particular case, Jewish, Israeli, and American.
Thank you, Aylana.
Thank you.